But if you look at what's happened, he's failed on almost every count. He has not done well in Iran. He has certainly not done well with regard to the genocide in Gaza. And he's not done well with regard to Ukraine.
So recently, John Mearsheimer was on Katie Halper's podcast talking about Trump's failing points and why he's not the president he thought he was when he walked into the Oval Office for his second term. Mearsheimer gets into several foreign policy theaters that the U.S. is involved in and the ramifications of the Trump foreign policy regime. He's one of the greatest foreign policy analysts as far as I'm concerned. So let's get his take. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Something that I heard you say on another show, which is that you actually didn't think that Trump would be a warmonger. Can you talk about your expectation, what that was based on, and how that compares to the reality that we've been witnessing?
Well, I think in the first administration, he was not a warmonger. He did a number of things that, escalated tensions in different areas. For example, he was the first president to arm the Ukrainians, at least with offensive weapons. So but I think by and large, in the first administration, he didn't give any indication that he was a warmonger. And when he ran in the campaign for the 2024 election, he went to great lengths to emphasize that he wanted to end all the forever wars and not start any more. And then right before he took office, as you remember, he forced Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire in Gaza. So at the very beginning, it looked like he was off to a good start. And then with regard to Ukraine, I thought there he was deeply committed to ending that war. And I thought that it may take him a bit more time than it should to shut that war down. But I thought he would eventually shut the war down and establish reasonably good relations with the Russians. But if you look at what's happened, he's failed on almost every count.
Yeah, I have to generally agree with Mearsheimer here, though I will disagree with some parts of that, especially in regard to Trump's first term. He's a foreign policy genius, so it's hard to kind of deny that, but I have a slightly different interpretation. Trump ramped up wars both in Yemen and in Syria, putting boots on the ground in Syria for the first time, and ramping up the war in Yemen, which was already, by the time that he took office, a blockade that had lasted something like 5 or 6 years, mostly instigated by Obama's presidency, that he decided to use one of his sole presidential vetoes to extend that war. Congress actually gave him a bill that would have shut down U.S. involvement in that war in general. He vetoed it, and he vetoed it on behalf of the Saudis, who expect U.S. Naval forces there to instigate a blockade. And that blockade, by the way, has killed about 500,000 people. He also ramped up bombing in 2018 and 2019. I will give him credit for normalizing relations with North Korea, which I think was his shining moment of his first term. But other than that, I agree. Trump did use a lot of rhetoric to make it known that, hey, I want to shut down the war in Ukraine. He certainly hasn't done that. He's actually decided to rearm Ukraine, and he's not willing to give up what it would take to force a peace there, and that is disengagement. Getting out of there. You can even serve as a facilitator between peace discussions if you want, Trump, as far as I'm concerned, but that won't happen. No peace will happen as long as you're a belligerent in the eyes of the Russians, and you are.
We used to call Joe Biden Genocide Joe when he was in the White House. We could easily call Donald Trump Genocide Don. I mean, he's continuing the genocide for sure. And with regard to Ukraine, he has failed to shut that war down. And with regard to Iran, the Biden administration at least had the good sense not to let the Israelis suck us into a war against Iran. The Israelis tried twice in 2024, but Biden didn't take the bite.
He did use some targeted strikes against Iran, but largely Mearsheimer's right about that.
Or take the bait. But in this case, with Trump in 2025, he took the bait. And on June 22nd, he attacked Iran. So he has not done well in Iran. He has certainly not done well with regard to the genocide in Gaza. And he's not done well with regard to Ukraine. And I would add one other case to this, and that's Yemen. You remember he went to war against Yemen. He said, "We'll end this quickly. I'm going to win decisively." After roughly 30 days, he quit and conceded defeat to Yemen, to the Houthis in Yemen.
And by the way, he criticized fiercely Biden in 2024 during the campaign trail. He was actually on the Tim Pool podcast, and he talks about how Biden showed weakness by deciding to launch bombing campaigns against Yemen, and he did that exact same thing in March. Throughout essentially the duration of March, he participated in targeted strikes against the Houthis, ostensibly because the Houthis were one of the only groups in the world willing to aid the Palestinians. They tried to send aid to the Palestinians in Gaza, and Israel didn't like that, and that's why, this spectacular display against Yemen was done. Not really spectacular. Remember, the Yemenis and the Houthi regime has been fighting a ground war versus Saudi Arabia for about a decade. Eventually, Saudi Arabia kind of shut down the ground war and has kind of, drawn its forces back from there. And also a decade-long starvation campaign by the U.S. in terms of that blockade. So they've outlasted a lot worse than what the U.S. did there.
But the point is that he actually started the fight against the Houthis. So if you look at his overall performance, he looks every bit as much as a warmonger as Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think maybe even more so in some regards. The wars are certainly, either status quo or more than what we saw under the Biden administration. We didn't see such a bigger scale war versus Iran. I know people will say, hey, that's just the 12-day war. Well, that war is going to continue because there's no longer any chance or semblance of normalization with Iran that will bring forward another nuclear weapons curtailment program like the JCPOA, and they have now unlimited incentive to develop a nuke. It's only a matter of time before the neocons and the Netanyahus of the world, as they've done almost my entire lifetime, and I'm 42, talk about how they're inches away, they're days away, they're weeks away, they're seconds away from a nuclear weapon, and then expect regime change again.
Yeah. You have stated that states are rational. Not irrational, but are space rational. So I wanted to know, governments are rational, I should say. Would you classify Trump's government as rational? Would you classify Biden's as rational? And if so, how?
Well, the point is, let's just take U.S.-Israeli relations. Israel is a strategic albatross around their neck. The policies that Israel pursues in the Middle East are not in our interest. And therefore, for the Biden administration or for the Trump administration to support the policies of Israel to the extent that we do is not rational, in my opinion. And here I'm talking only about Israel being a strategic albatross around our neck. It's also a moral albatross. It's a double whammy. From a strategic point of view and from a moral point of view, our relationship with Israel is not rational. And that was true under Joe Biden, and it's true under Donald Trump.
Lots of continuity between those two in that regard, too. But Mearsheimer's right when he says, Trump in some ways has been worse because he allowed Netanyahu to violate the ceasefire that he orchestrated, the day before he stepped into the Oval Office, his second term in Gaza.
And of course, the reason that we pursue this particular policy towards Israel is because of the lobby. The Israel lobby puts enormous pressure on policymakers to support Israel unconditionally. And that, of course, is what we're doing. It was very interesting to listen to you talk to the previous guest. And the conversation really revolves around what Israel is doing in Gaza. But the truth is, it's not just Israel, it's Israel and the United States. And Israel would not be able to pursue the policies that it's pursuing in Gaza with regard to Iran, with regard to Lebanon, and with regard to Syria without complete support from the United States. The reason that Israel is able to behave so aggressively is the United States supports it at every turn. We give
Absolutely, in addition to the fact that it's the only country in that region with a secret nuclear weapons program, and yet, of course, it went to war against an enemy power, Iran, under the premise that it had a secret nuclear weapons program. And that's something the US enabled. Kennedy tried to stop it for a time in the 1960s, shortly before his death. It was called the Domina Project, and there's correspondence that he wanted to do whatever he could to stop them from getting a nuke, but they do, and for some reason there's a special carve out for them. They don't have to have IAEA inspections or anything like that. They're not part of the NPT at all. So it's the US support and the Israel lobby and their nuclear weapons program that's allowing them to attack, I think, something like 4 or 5 of their neighbors, even since October 7th. They've attacked Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, trying to expand the West Bank settlements in the pursuit of this greater Israel project. You know, the genocide in Gaza, where they're trying to establish a concentration zone, and they can call it transfers or whatever they want, relocation. But, you know, the writing's on the wall of what this means. They want to cleanse that populace, and they'll still blame it on Hamas no matter what, no matter how many babies are pulled up through the rubble as they do it.
Give the Israelis huge amounts of money, huge amounts of weaponry, and diplomatic support. And that frees the Israelis up to pursue these policies that I would argue are not in America's interest, as I just said, but I would also argue are not in Israel's interest. I think what's going on in the Middle East today is a disaster for Israel. And over time, I think more and more people will recognize that.
Yeah, more and more people on the right are recognizing that. I think on the dissident right, catching up to a lot of the voices on the dissident left on it. Let's hope that's true in Israel because, you know, the culture there is not all pro-Likud, pro-right-wing, pro-Netanyahu. Netanyahu was going to go down under corruption and fraud charges, which are still outstanding, by the way. They just delayed a court appearance that he had in that regard. But it seems to me that the proof is that as long as he keeps launching wars and continues the genocide, he's going to be able to stay in office. The next election isn't even until October 2026. And who knows if he can get reelected? I don't know. But, you know, hopefully more Israelis wake up to this too. This will not bode well. Posterity will not look back at this and people that sided with Netanyahu on this as a good thing. I'm pretty convinced about that.
And how is that? How can you expand on what makes it a disaster for Israel?
Well, I think from a moral point of view, the genocide is a stain on Israel's reputation. It's going to be everlasting. It's going to be there forever. I mean, this is a genocide. And it's not just any genocide, it's a genocide that's basically being filmed. We can see it happening before our eyes. With regard to the Holocaust, hardly anybody saw any evidence of what was happening. The word got out of Europe that a Holocaust was taking place or a genocide against the Jews was taking place, but we couldn't see pictures of that. We didn't really know exactly what was going on at the time. And it took really a long time to sort of unpack what happened between 1941 and 1945 in Europe. But in the case of what's going on in Gaza, it's manifestly apparent what's going on.
Yeah, that's exactly true. We see this playing out on TikTok every day, on Instagram. We see the pictures and the babies and the innocents being killed, you know, complete city blocks reduced to rubble, places where 80% of the buildings are just completely destroyed, even in Rafah, I think the biggest city that was in Gaza. This is not something that is completely concealable from the American public in the way that, say, Vietnam was and other genocides like in Rwanda. And I think 1995, remember, there was a genocide there. And, you know, there was some pressure to enter into that affair militarily, but there was never any pictures that Americans truly saw about that and live video feeds and streams and things like that. The new media has opened up a lot of windows into the cold and vile and bloody catastrophes that are these destructive campaigns like the one Israel is consummating in Gaza.
And this makes it all the more shocking, by the way, that it's been allowed to go on. The fact that people haven't revolted and forced their governments to shut this down is truly shocking. But anyway, my first point would be that this is a disaster for Israel. Second, the idea that Israel is going to have perfect security by beating up on every state in the region and breaking countries apart like Syria and Iran and Egypt and maybe Turkey is a pipe dream. That's not going to happen. And Israel, in the process, is going to do enormous damage to itself. It's going to end up fighting wars forever and ever. And this is not in Israel's interest, especially since those adversaries are eventually going to get the military capability to threaten Israel in serious ways. And the best example of this is the case of Iran. The Israelis are running around, and of course, Donald Trump is as well, and many hawks in the United States, saying that we have just delivered this hammer blow to Iran. We have obliterated their nuclear program. They're never going to get nuclear weapons. And if they make any steps in that direction, we'll just go back in and slam them again. Uh, I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that. I think that the Iranian nuclear program is alive. The Iranians remain committed to at least enriching uranium. And I would be willing to bet that behind closed doors, they're committed to developing a bomb.
Yeah, who wouldn't be after they were bullied around by the biggest, baddest bullies on the block in the form of the US and Israel over that war? They can see what's going on. The world watches how the US treats, say, North Korea, where regime change isn't on the table, despite the fact that George W. Bush said, hey, that country's part of the axis of evil, compared to, say, oh, Libya, the country that gave up its nuclear weapons program. It was in kind of an infantile state, but they gave that up in like the mid 2000s. You had this grand speech by George W. Bush that Libya is entering into, a new palladium of nations that are modernizing and behaving in the right way. Well, they got overthrown by a US-led NATO coup, funding rebels there, and that's what they got. So yeah, if I'm an Iranian, I'm going to fast track a nuke. But Mearsheimer's also right about this, that this is a bipartisan thing. The fact that the Israel lobby has so much sway and command over both sides of the political aisle in the United States. So you see an enormous amount of continuity between, say, how Trump treats Israel compared to how Biden treated Israel. And hey, if anything, Trump's probably the most pro-Israel president ever, if being pro-Israel means supporting its worst excesses, because he moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. That was, a strategy that kind of precludes in some ways the possibility of a future Palestinian state. He signed the Abraham Accords, which his own DHS warned him would inflame some tensions throughout the region. He begs and pleads with the Knesset to try to get Netanyahu off of his fraud and corruption charges. He constantly praises that evil, vile guy as a war hero. It's disgusting. It's vile. But this is what you see in the American political system. And if you want a book that delves into this deeper, you're looking at the best author of a book of that kind. Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt wrote an excellent book called The Israel Lobby. Highly recommended.
They're not going to advertise that, certainly not at this point in time. But I would not be surprised for 1 second. In fact, I think it's likely that they will develop a bomb. So Israel hasn't solved this problem. In fact, they've made the situation worse. And the idea that they've won this great victory against Iran, or that we won this great victory against Iran, is simply not true. If anything, the key question is why the Iranians agreed to a ceasefire. If I had been playing the Iranians' hand, I would not have agreed to a ceasefire. I would have let the war go on for a couple more weeks. The Israelis were in real trouble because huge amounts of damage were being done to Israeli territory. And furthermore, the Israelis were running out of defensive missiles. And there was no shortage of ballistic missiles and drones and cruise missiles on the Iranian side.
Yeah, he's right. Some of the Iranian missiles got through the Iron Dome, by the way. And I think Americans don't need to thank Donald Trump for getting us out of what could have been the worst scenario in Iran, a full-fledged regime change campaign. with followed by, a 20 plus year occupation like we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq because of Iranian restraint. Iran actually behaved in a way that was completely contrary to what all the neocons and Zionists and Netanyahu fanboys thought they would do. And that was, try to take out as many Israelis as possible, take out as many American soldiers in the Arabian Peninsula as possible. Instead, they tipped Trump off to the fact that they have to make a show reprisal, which didn't have any chance of attacking them. So they behaved in a way where they did not want this war, and that's why it didn't continue. As far as the war dragging on, I think there's some merit to that. But hey, if I'm Iran and, I'm a partisan or an Iranian propagandist, I'd celebrate this too, because the regime remains in place. They have uranium. It looks like some of it was smuggled out of Fordow in the weeks in advance. You saw motorcades from satellite images kind of showing that probably is what happened. And it seems to preclude the possibility of an internal regime change kind of rebellion or uprising, because all the people are galvanized behind the government now. I don't see American flags there. They got attacked by Israel. Israel made it basically impossible for that to really be, a political phenomenon that's panned out.
So one could make a good argument that the Iranians should have continued the war. All of this is to say that if the Israelis and the Americans start the war up again, I wouldn't bet that Israel and the United States are going to win that war. Just to take this one step further, and this is where the Americans come into play, it's quite clear that one of the reasons that Trump wanted to shut the war down after the June 22 attacks was because there was evidence that the Iranians were going to mine the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah, they threatened to shut down the Straits of Hormuz, and lots of that, oil goes to the proceeds of the U.S. in terms of trade. A lot of it goes to China too, but that would have been catastrophic for the world economy. Trump didn't want that kind of catastrophe to transpire under his watch. So thankfully, again, he took the off ramp, even though he put regime change on the table in that Truth Social post where he said, gee, if Iran doesn't make itself great again, why not a regime change? It is so ridiculous and stupid. You could have had that kind of tweet authored by Mark Levin or Ben Shapiro or Lindsey Graham or any other neocon.
And that really spooked Trump, as it should have. All of this is to say that if we have another conflict, there's a possibility that the Iranians will mine the Straits. And if they mine the Straits and we have a huge economic crisis, this will not be good for anyone on the planet, and certainly for the Trump administration. So the point is that even absent nuclear weapons, the Iranians have cards to play. But the Israelis act like they can just slap the Iranians around. It has no real consequences. And to the extent that it might have consequences, Iran's going to fall apart, much the way Syria did. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that. And I could go on and on with regard to this. We could talk about the centrifugal forces that are at play inside of Israel itself. This is not a happy society. This is a society that has wicked fault lines, and the animosity across those fault lines is not to be underestimated. And when you fight wars all the time like this, it invariably exacerbates those antagonisms. So I think if you look at the body politic and you look at Israel's situation in the broader region, I think the idea that they're in great shape and they just need to apply a little bit more force and get a little bit more support from the United States is not the way you want to look at this.
Yeah, I have to agree there. All they've gotten is support from the United States. Last year, about $20 billion. Because of October 7th, the justification was, hey, we need to give them more money to deal with this threat of Hamas. And the response, of course, hasn't been proportionate whatsoever. Hamas is just about decimated. I don't think they'll ever be destroyed because of a war like this. In fact, I think it will inspire more people to be wanting to be Hamas or Hezbollah recruits in the future. But Hamas isn't a fighting force right now. They haven't fired a missile from Gaza into Israel since April. And before that, it was sporadic. Meanwhile, you have somewhere between 60 and 100,000 people dead already. 150,000 on top of that more missing, likely a majority of that figure dead. You have huge swaths of Gaza reduced to rubble, and the political class in the United States still makes excuses for it, financing this war regardless of the party in power, and it spills over into disputes politically in the United States as well. And rightly so, this is a catastrophe. This is not America first. This is Israel first to the core. And the state remains the same regardless of the names. It's something that I always say about this, is that the Israel lobby's influence is pervasive. It's, it has extreme continuity between administrations, and it's infected the bureaucratic class too, and the mainstream media. The mainstream media is not covering this conflict as we know people on TikTok are, but younger people are changing their minds on this. World opinion has turned against Israel. You see voices even on the right waking up to it. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massey speaking out against it. Tucker Carlson making it a point to say, Israel should take care of its own concerns. I'm America first, and America should be the centerpiece of all American policy, including foreign policy. So why are we funding Israel? People like that are really influential, and you're seeing it among young activists too, even on the right. Again, distant left has always been good on this, at least as long as I've lived, for the most part. And I think the fact that Kamala Harris ignored this issue during the campaign and essentially, tried to basically avoid the issue and not carve out a distinct position that was contrary to Trump's might have cost her the election. I mean, lots of other things probably cost her the election, but that was something that left the Democratic base hanging. A lot of people were enraged about how this was playing out. And I think Mearsheimer is right in assessing Trump. In many ways, his foreign policy is either status quo Joe Biden's or worse in some regards. Worse especially in terms of launching the new war in Iran, saber rattling with Yemen again, which Biden did too, to be fair to Trump, and, being antagonistic toward China over Taiwan. They're militarizing the Pacific. Biden did that too to an extent. But Trump hasn't done what he set out to do as his first primary foreign policy goal, and that's to secure peace in Ukraine. He won't do it as long as the U.S. bankrolls this war and seeks out funding from Congress to continue supplying them with arms and intelligence and resources. That's where we're at. But I know I want to hear from what you guys think. Let me know down below. Is Mearsheimer right as he assesses Trump's foreign policy in his second term? Is he wrong? Were you kind of flabbergasted with how Trump's behaving in this term as far as it goes when it comes to foreign policy? Let me know down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Katie Halper too. Great podcast. I really appreciated this interview she did. And please consider becoming a YouTube member of mine by clicking the join button below. If you join, you'll support the channel, and in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.